Hey guys, welcome to the video, and today we'll be seeing how you can create and use environment variables properly in your Next.js applications. We'll be discussing both of the methods of injecting environment variables, namely your dot files and your next.config file, and we'll also be seeing how you can avoid overriding your environment variables, especially when you're using both of the methods or if you're using multiple dot files within the same project. So without any further ado, let's get straight into it. So here we are on VS Code where we have our starter Next.js application. It's the same starter application that we have been using for a past few tutorials. Now before we go on and integrate our application, let's first take a minute to understand what environment variables are and why do we even need them. So environment variables, just like any other variable, store values, but these values are of a special kind which we do not want to hard code in our application code. So we do not want to declare these variables inside the source code of our application, but instead we want them to be present in the external running environment. For example, Next.js runs on the Node.js environment, and the Node.js environment has a module called process which stores all of the environment variables. Here I'm on the official documentation of the process module of Node.js, and here if you notice there is something called process.env. Now process.env is just a simple object which stores all of our environment variables as key value pairs. So here in this example, things like user, path, password are all being stored as environment variables, and accessing them on the node environment is really easy. You just need to mention the environment variable name prefixed by the process.env object. Now you might ask the question, what kind of values do we need to store as environment variables? And the answer to that would be any value or configuration which is sensitive and is supposed to be protected and kept as a secret is the best candidate for being stored in the environment. Now in Next.js, starting version 9.4, adding more environment variables to your process.env has become really simple because now Next.js natively supports .env files. So the first point to keep in mind here is that you do not need any other third-party library to load environment variables. Now a .env file is just a simple dot file which would look something like this. So here in our application in the root directory, I'll be creating a new file called .env. Normally .env files are stored in the root directory itself and its contents are just key value pairs. So for example, I want to create a new environment variable called app name and its value is Next.js app. Now one thing to keep in mind here is that all of your environment variable values are parsed as string. So if we save this file and start our Next.js application, in our current environment we'll have access to a new key under process.env called app name. Now here in the documentation, the dot file is called .env.local. .local just represents our current working environment. Other examples can be .development for a development server or .production for a production server. And in this next line, they've also mentioned one very nice feature that was recently added, that if you want to expose environment variables to the browser, which means that if you want to include a particular environment variable in your client bundle, which will be accessible on a user's browser, all we need to do is just prefix the environment variable with the key next public. Now I'll explain what this means. Any environment variable which does not have the next public prefix will only be available on the server side. So as most of you know, Next.js allows you to create APIs and it also has server-side rendered pages. For example, in our application, our index.js page is server-side rendered and exposes a function called getServerSideProps. Here we can write our code to fetch props using some API during the build time of the page and then pass it to our main index component here as props. So if we don't add the prefix next public, the environment variable will just be present whenever server-side operations are happening. So to prove this, I've added two console log statements. The first one is present inside the getServerSideProps function. Here, your environment variable will be printed with the message server side. And then again, in our main component, I've added another log statement where the same environment variable will be printed with the message client side. Now let's save everything, start our development server using npm run dev, and we'll be checking if we are able to see the particular logs. So if we go to the browser, try to access our index page, you'll see that the client side environment variable is undefined, but at the same time, On the server side, it's clearly defined. So in the server logs, you're able to see the value as Next.js app, which we have set in our .env file. Now coming back to this prefix functionality, let's create another environment variable, which will be called next underscore public underscore app name. And let's call this Next.js starter and make some changes in our index.js file. So instead of printing process.env.app name, this time we'll print next public app name. Save the changes, run our development server again. The environment variables are loaded. Let's go ahead and refresh our index page. And here in the logs, you'll be able to see that this time we can access the environment variable which was prefixed by next public key. So as I said, environment variables usually store secrets and you would not want these values to be exposed on the client side. But in some cases, there can be values which you would want to be accessible throughout the application as an environment variable. And for that, you can definitely just add the next public prefix to your environment variable name, and it will also be accessible on the client side. So this is how you can add environment variables by creating a .env file and then access them inside your pages by simply mentioning the key name after process.env. Now, one thing to remember here is that in order to keep server only secrets safe, Next.js mutates the process.env object in a way that the object is not a JavaScript standard object anymore. So you cannot use object destructuring on process.env object. So you can't maybe write something like this, where you're trying to destructure a certain key value from process.env. This will throw an error. You have to mention the names separately every time you're using environment variables in Next.js. Now, Next.js also allows you to refer to the value of other environment variables in a different environment variable. Let me show you how. So let's say I wanted to make an API call in our get server side props function. And for that, I'm making a fetch call, something like this, where I'm calling an endpoint using fetch and then storing the details in user details variable. But I'd want this particular API host to be present as an environment variable. So I can maybe store the root host name in a variable called hostname in our .env file. So this environment variable will just store the root host name of the API endpoint. And I can create another variable, let's say user endpoint, where I can refer to the hostname variable using the $, and then append or prepend more data to it. So we have stored the endpoint that we were calling under user endpoint. So here, instead of hard coding the API endpoint in our get server side props function, what we'll do is we'll access the environment variable process.env.user endpoint. Since this is a API call, we'll have to use a wait and make our function async. And let's just console log the user details to see if our endpoint variable works. We'll start the development server again. Let's refresh the index page. And here you can see that the API data was fetched and we were able to use this environment variable, which refers to the value of another environment variable successfully in our server-side props function. The $, is a reserved character here in .env. So if your string, let's say, has an actual $, value, for example, some passwords I've seen looking like this. So to store such values, you'll have to escape the $, by adding the / character. So I'll have to store the password like this. Just a little something to keep in mind if the value of your environment variables has a $. Now the last thing that I wanted to talk about dotfiles is that how you name your dotfile actually matters, especially when you're running a development server versus a production server. So in our current example, we were running the development server because we were using the command npm run dev to start our application. What npm run dev does is it sets an environment variable called node.env to the value of development. And for a .env file, we have named the file as simple.env. But if you notice here, this is the last name that is taken into preference. Now to prove that the environment variables will be overridden depending on their name, I'll be creating more .env files. Right now there are 3 dot files called .env, .env.development and .env.production. Now as per this particular preference, when we run npm run dev, our .env.development file will be given more preference over the .env file, and when we run npm start, our .env.production will be given more preference over .env. So let's quickly go ahead and prove this overriding preference structure. So I'll be running the command npm run dev, and since the node environment will be set to development, the env file which should be getting preference is r.env.development, and the password that will be printed will be dev password. So I'll hit enter, refresh our page, and as you can see the password is dev password. Similarly, let's run npm start. We'll refresh our index page, and since next start sets the node environment to production, this time we'll be seeing the password that's being picked up from the .env.production file, which is production password. So in both our npm run dev and npm start cases, the .env was overridden by the respective environment .files. But prior to version 9.4, if you wanted to declare environment variables in Next.js, you had to update them inside the next.config.js file. Do not skip this part because this particular config file is still valid, and I'll show you a very cool trick which you can also use while writing environment variables in this config file. So to use next.config.js to inject environment variables, all I need to do is create a file called next.config.js. So I'll go back to our project. In the root directory, I'll create next.config.js. And all this file needs to do is export an object with the key env. And this env key stores an object with the actual environment variable key along with their values. So following the standard naming convention, I'll create an environment variable called secret, and I'll keep the value as my secret, let's say. And then to test if this particular environment variable was created in our index file, let's just try to log this one. I'll remove the other logs for now, and let's also console log this on the client side to check if this variable is being loaded in both server and client side. Let's start our development server. You'll be able to see that the secret value is loaded in both the client side and the server side. So whenever you load an environment variable using next.config.js, it adds the environment variable both to your backend environment and also your client bundle. So be aware of this fact. But yeah, as I said, one little cool thing that you can do here is that since this is a JavaScript file, you can write JavaScript code to fetch the value of your environment variables. For example, I'll be creating a new environment variable called author. Now its value I'd like to keep as the author that's present in my package.json. So I want this particular author key to be read and stored as an environment variable. For that, I'll be creating a function up here called fetch author. And since I have to read a file, I'll also import the file system module. So I'll say const fs require the fs module. Here inside the function, I'll just call fs.readFileSync, and I want to read the package.json file. Now since I only want the key author, I'll parse this whole file as a JavaScript object, and I'll destructure the author value from it. So that's it. And this function in the end just returns this author value. Now instead of having a hard-coded string, I can call my fetch author function, store this, and let's see if we can access this particular environment variable. So in our index.js, instead of printing secret, I'll print the author environment variable. Save the changes, start our development server again, and we'll refresh our index page. And as you can see, both on the client side and server side, the author name was fetched with the help of this little function here. Now this was the last little thing that I wanted to discuss. If this video helped you in any way, please hit on the like button and share it with someone else if you feel that it might help them. Also subscribe to the channel if you're not subscribed already. I post new videos every week, and I'll be seeing you guys in the next one.